Joining me now for more is Everett Eissenstat. He was the Deputy Director of the National Economic Council during Trump's first term. He was also a Deputy Assistant to President Trump for International Economic Affairs. Everett, thank you so much for being here. I can't think of a better person to have this conversation with. Let's talk about this plan. Across the board tariffs, 25%. Is that an effective trade policy, or does it make more sense to be strategic with how you implement tariffs like this?
Well, as you know, tariffs can be a tool, and they can be a tool with a lot of different rationales behind them. So I think when you look at whether they should be used holistically or strategically, it's really what is your intent and what is it that you're trying to achieve. I think in this instance, first we need to recognize that he's not in office yet. This is based upon a post that he put out in social media. So he can't take effect until, he's actually in office. In many ways, he's kind of signaling where he's going and providing an opportunity for both government and business to say, well, this is serious. This is really coming, and we need to think about how to effectively manage it.
So do you think then that this is a negotiating tactic? This is, he's set the bar for how far he's willing to go, but there may be some room to talk? Is it?
I don't think we're set the bar on how far he's willing to go. I think it's more testing the waters on how markets and governments and companies will react. I mean, this was a very specific, fact-driven threat, and it was based upon particular countries and particular things that were happening within those countries. Yeah. That's different than an across-the-board 10 to 20% tariff. That candidly we don't know how that would be implemented or whether it will be implemented, and we still have time to evaluate that, and that waits to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, you worked in a Trump administration before. Obviously, he made good on tariff threats in the last administration. So do you think he appreciates the implications of an across-the-board blanket tariff and what that could mean for the economy?
I think he appreciates the power of tariffs, and it's something that it's new, and even I think what we're facing now is quite different than what we had in the first administration. In the first administration, there was a continued debate about how to use tariffs and in what way, and there were certain statutes that were used for certain purposes. A lot of those policies were actually carried on by President Biden, still in effect today. So the fact there's bipartisan support for that, the fact the economy rebounded and continues to do fairly well, I think demonstrates that you can use tariffs effectively to achieve outcomes. What are the limits of that? We don't know, because it's been quite some time since we've had that degree of tariff imposition across the board in a global context.
Yeah, so let's expand that out and talk about the potential implications, because Mexico's president already signaling that she would implement retaliatory tariffs. Obviously, China has said that they are not willing and do not want to get into a trade war. Is there the possibility that this could trigger something along those lines where both sides start implementing heavy tariffs and that has a real impact on the global economy?
It certainly could. And the impact on the global economy is obviously very complex. There's a lot of factors that go into it. There's energy prices, conflicts, taxation policies, regulatory policies. But tariffs definitely have an impact on the cost of goods. And more than that, they have an impact on where goods flow and how they flow. And so on supply chains. And one of the situations we have now is that a lot of companies have built supply chains on this just-in-time, construct that really came out post-World War II. We're in a different era now. Economic security, national security is really at the forefront. And that's something that started in the Trump administration, continued through the Biden administration, and it's actually probably going to accelerate under the next Trump administration. So it's really about supply chains, and yes, they can contribute to growth, but they're only one factor of growth. They're not the determining factor. It's just one element that needs to be mixed in with many other different economic factors.
And I wonder how the impact of kind of this looming threat of tariffs, how long that can be effective. At some point, do you have to actually implement it, or can it continue to be a negotiating tactic? When do you have to actually make good on the threat?
Well, let's be clear. He actually did make good on many of his campaign promises. And I think one of the distinctions, at least for my time with the administration, when I was serving as one of his negotiators in international fora, is that he really means what he says. He's pretty literal. If he says, this is what I want, or this is what I'm going to do, the prospects of that happening are fairly high. So he campaigned on tariffs. He was very transparent about it. In fact, maybe overly transparent. He was elected with a broad mandate, won the swing states, won the popular vote. And so there seems to be a political mandate to at least test these policies and see if they can help, resolve some of the long-standing trade inequities that do exist in today's globe. And I think we shouldn't lose we should not lose sight of that fact. There are imbalances in trade.
Right.
They need to be addressed, and I don't think that the existing institutions have done a good enough job of meeting that need. So that leads to a unilateral approach. And can it help contribute to an ultimate solution? I think it can. But
my last question I want to get in is, this could blow up the USMCA, which is something that President Trump negotiated. Does it set the stage for a new negotiation? How does this impact that?
I think it's a great question, but even backing up further than that, both Vice President Harris and President Trump had already indicated during the campaign that the USMCA was going to be renegotiated, more than likely than not. So I think it is probably going to go in for a renegotiation. I think it's a really important agreement when our economies are closely intertwined. But there's been a number of disputes, bilateral disputes that remain unresolved. There's a number of issues that need to be re-examined to see how well they're working. It was actually pretty clever when Ambassador Lighthizer negotiated this agreement to put in a provision that was unprecedented at the time to have a review clause to say, okay, how is this agreement working? And if it's not working in the way we intended it to, do we need to make adjustments? So it's on the table, and it's going to be something that's going to be a big topic of conversation.
All right, great. Well, your insight, terrific. We appreciate you being here. Thanks so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.